What happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable spirit? When the most feared man in boxing laughs at someone who's already lost everything? This is the story of Rocky Balboa's most impossible fight, the one that would either destroy him completely or prove that heart beats fear every single time. Comment below. What would you do if Mike Tyson laughed at your dreams? Let's find out what happens when respect is earned the hardest way possible. The silence before the storm always cuts deeper than the thunder. Madison Square Garden, December 1987, and 20,000 people packed into those blood-stained seats knew they were about to witness something biblical. The kind of violence that makes gods out of mortals and ghosts out of legends. But what they didn't expect was to see a man's soul get murdered right there under those blazing lights in front of the whole damn world. Mike Tyson owned everything that mattered. 21 years old, undefeated heavyweight champion of the world, and every single person in that arena, from the janitors to the billionaires in the front row, knew they were looking at a walking natural disaster. His shoulders rolled like earthquake tremors when he moved. His hands, wrapped tight in black tape, looked like sledgehammers designed by God specifically to break other men's dreams. When Tyson stepped into that ring, the canvas itself seemed to bend under the weight of his reputation. Iron Mike, they called him, and iron doesn't bend, doesn't break, doesn't forgive. He'd knocked out Trevor Berbick for the title, demolished James Smith, crushed Tony Tucker, all in the same brutal year. Each fight lasted about as long as a sneeze, each opponent crumpled like paper dolls in a hurricane. Tyson didn't just win fights, he erased men from the sport entirely. Some never fought again, others woke up in hospital rooms 3 days later, asking what truck hit them. The crowd buzzing tonight knew they weren't watching a boxing match, they were watching an execution. Rocky Balboa, the aging former champion from Philadelphia, had somehow talked his way into this ring through sheer stubbornness and the kind of American delusion that makes men think they can fly if they believe hard enough. 37 years old, slower than he used to be, with more scar tissue than original skin around his eyes. His last 3 fights had been ugly affairs, bloody, grinding wars that left him looking like hamburger meat shaped into human form. The bookmakers had stopped taking bets. This wasn't gambling, it was theft. Vegas odds makers called it legalized murder. Sports writers typed up Balboa's obituary before the opening bell. Even his own corner looked like they were attending a funeral instead of working a fight. His trainer, Mickey Goldmill, had died 2 years earlier, and without that gruff old voice in his ear, Rocky seemed lost, like a ship without an anchor in a storm made of bone and muscle. But here's what nobody understood, what they couldn't see from their comfortable seats with their overpriced beer and bloodthirsty expectations. Rocky Balboa had already died once, not physically, but spiritually. After Mickey's funeral, after watching his legend fade into memory, after realizing that Father Time remained undefeated against every fighter who ever lived. He'd lost his restaurant, his money, his sense of purpose. Adrian, his wife, worked double shifts just to keep their South Philly house from getting foreclosed. Their son, Rocky Jr., looked at his father with a mixture of embarrassment and pity that cut deeper than any punch ever could. So when Don King, that electric-haired carnival barker, offered Rocky this fight, this public humiliation disguised as a payday, Rocky didn't see it as suicide. He saw it as resurrection. One last chance to prove that courage isn't about winning. It's about showing up when everybody expects you to stay home. It's about looking fear in the face and saying, "I ain't running." The arena lights dimmed, and 20,000 voices rose like a tsunami of noise. Tyson's entrance music pounded through the speakers, something dark and ominous that sounded like war drums calling soldiers to their deaths. He walked to the ring like a panther stalking prey, every step deliberate, every movement radiating the kind of confidence that comes from never knowing defeat. His eyes, cold as winter mornings, scanned the crowd like a predator choosing which sheep to slaughter first. In the opposite corner, Rocky Balboa sat on his stool, hands folded, head bowed like a man praying for salvation or accepting damnation. Maybe both. The crowd barely noticed his entrance. He was already forgotten, already a footnote in Tyson's inevitable victory story. But something flickered in Rocky's eyes, something the cameras couldn't capture and the commentators couldn't understand. It wasn't fear or resignation. It was recognition. Rocky recognized this moment because he'd lived it before, in a dozen different rings against a dozen different monsters. And monsters, he'd learned, all bleed the same color. The weigh-in had been a masterpiece of psychological warfare, and Mike Tyson was Picasso with intimidation. 24 hours before the fight, the Felt Forum buzzed with reporters, photographers, and fight officials who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. This wasn't a weigh-in, it was a public execution preview, and everyone knew it. Tyson stepped onto the scale first, naturally. Champions always went first, and nobody questioned Mike Tyson's championship status, not if they valued their consciousness. 218 pounds of concentrated violence, muscle stacked on muscle like armor plating. His body looked like it had been carved from granite by someone who really hated granite. Each muscle group seemed to have its own personal vendetta against the rest of humanity. But it was his eyes that made grown men step backward involuntarily. Those weren't human eyes. They belonged to something that had crawled up from whatever place nightmares go to die. When Tyson looked at you, you felt like prey. Not an opponent, not a competitor, prey. Something to be hunted, caught, and consumed. He'd perfected that stare in reform school, refined it in amateur tournaments, and weaponized it as a professional. It was a look that said, I'm going to hurt you in ways you can't imagine, and I'm going to enjoy every second of it. The reporters fired questions like bullets, but Tyson deflected them all with the same terrifying calm. Rocky's a legend, he said, his voice soft and almost respectful, which somehow made it more menacing. But legends belong in museums, not boxing rings. Tomorrow night, I'm going to put him where he belongs. He paused, that predatory smile creeping across his face like a crack in a dam. I'm going to hurt him. Bad. Real bad. Then Rocky stepped onto the scale, and the room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Not from intimidation, from pity. At 37, he looked every day of it plus interest. His face was a roadmap of every war he'd ever fought. Scar tissue over his left eye, thick as leather, nose bent in 3 places, jaw slightly off-center from that brutal beating Apollo Creed had given him in their rematch. 201 pounds, 17 lighter than Tyson, and those 17 pounds might as well have been 17 years. His hands, when they hung at his sides, trembled slightly. Not from fear, from all those years of punishment, all those shots to the head that his brain never quite forgot. Parkinson's would claim him eventually, though nobody knew it yet. But his body was already keeping score, already preparing its final bill for all those rounds of abuse he'd absorbed like a human punching bag. The media smelled blood in the water. Questions came like machine gun fire. Rocky, do you really think you can win? Are you concerned about serious injury? Is this just about the money? Each question was really asking the same thing. Why are you committing suicide on national television? Rocky answered in that soft Philadelphia drawl that had become as famous as his left hook. I ain't here to win pretty, he said, looking directly into the cameras. I ain't here to dance around or make speeches. I'm here to fight. That's what I do. That's who I am. He paused, searching for words that felt true instead of just confident. Mike's a great fighter, maybe the greatest, but tomorrow night he's going to find out what happens when you try to break something that's already been broken so many times it forgot how to stay down. The room erupted in laughter. Not cruel laughter exactly, but the kind of nervous chuckling that happens when someone tells a joke at a funeral. Even some of the reporters couldn't hide their smiles. Here was this broken-down old fighter talking about heart and determination against a man who could probably kill him with his bare hands. But Tyson wasn't laughing. He was studying Rocky like a scientist examining a particularly interesting specimen. Something in the old fighter's voice, some quality he couldn't quite identify, made his predatory instincts twitch. It wasn't fear he was hearing. It wasn't false bravado either. It was something else, something Tyson had never encountered before in any of his previous victims. It was acceptance. Rocky Balboa had already made peace with whatever was going to happen in that ring, and somehow that made him more dangerous than any undefeated record ever could. The laugh started low, somewhere deep in Mike Tyson's chest, like thunder rolling across distant mountains. Then it built, growing larger and more menacing, until it filled every corner of the press room. It was the kind of laugh that made children hide under beds and grown men check over their shoulders. When Iron Mike Tyson laughed at you, it wasn't amusement. It was a promise of pain wrapped in dark humor. "You forgot how to stay down?" Tyson's voice cut through the sudden silence like a blade through silk. He stepped closer to Rocky, close enough that the heat from his body felt like standing next to a furnace. "Old man, I'm gonna remind you how to stay down. I'm gonna remind you so hard you'll never get up again." The reporters leaned forward like vultures, sensing roadkill. This was the moment they'd been waiting for. The psychological breakdown, the moment when Rocky Balboa finally realized he'd bitten off more than anyone could chew. Cameras flashed like lightning, capturing what everyone assumed would be the exact second Rocky's courage cracked under the weight of Tyson's overwhelming presence. But Rocky didn't crack. He didn't step backward, didn't break eye contact, didn't show even the slightest tremor of intimidation. Instead, he did something that no one expected, something that had never happened to Mike Tyson in his entire professional career. Rocky smiled. Not a confident smile, not a defiant grin, just a quiet, almost sad smile that seemed to come from somewhere very deep and very genuine. "Mike," Rocky said, his voice barely above a whisper but somehow carrying to every corner of the room. "I've been knocked down more times than I can count. I've been broken, busted, beat up and written off. I've been poor. I've been rich. I've been forgotten. I've been famous. I buried my best friend, nearly lost my wife, watched my son grow up ashamed of his old man." He paused, that strange smile never wavering. "But the one thing I ain't never been, the one thing nobody's ever been able to make me be, is afraid of getting hurt." The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't the silence of anticipation or bloodlust. It was the silence that comes when everyone in a room suddenly realizes they're witnessing something they don't quite understand, but know they'll remember forever. Tyson's laugh died in his throat like a candle being snuffed out. For just a moment, maybe 2 seconds, maybe less, something flickered across his face that nobody had ever seen there before. Uncertainty. Not about his ability to destroy Rocky Balboa, that was never in question, but uncertainty about what kind of man he was about to destroy. In all his fights, all his victories, Tyson had never faced an opponent who seemed genuinely unafraid of him. Intimidated opponents were predictable. Terrified opponents were easy to break. But a man who truly wasn't afraid? That was uncharted territory, Rocky continued, his voice growing slightly stronger. "Tomorrow night, you're going to hit me with everything you got. And I'm going to get up. You're going to hit me again, harder. And I'm probably going to get up again. You might knock me down 10 times, Mike, but I'm going to keep getting up until either you can't knock me down anymore, or I can't get up anymore." He stepped slightly closer, close enough that Tyson could see the deep sincerity in his eyes. "And you know what? Either way is fine by me." The press room erupted into chaos. Reporters shouted questions, photographers' flashes exploded like fireworks, and officials tried to maintain some semblance of order. But through all the noise and confusion, 2 men stood perfectly still, locked in a moment that transcended boxing, transcended sport, transcended everything except the pure essence of human will meeting human will. Tyson's handlers quickly moved him toward the exit, sensing that their fighter had somehow lost control of the narrative. But as they led him away, Tyson couldn't stop looking back at Rocky, couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just encountered something he'd never faced before. Not another fighter, but a mirror, a reflection of what he might have been if life had taught him different lessons. Rocky watched him go, that same quiet smile on his face. Tomorrow night would bring pain beyond imagination. But tonight, for the first time in years, Rocky Balboa felt truly alive. He'd reminded himself of something he'd almost forgotten in all those years of defeat and disappointment. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's moving forward despite the fear, getting up despite the pain, fighting despite the odds. And sometimes, just sometimes, that's enough to change everything. The gymnasium where Rocky trained was a monument to forgotten dreams and faded glory. Mick's boxing gym in North Philadelphia, where the paint peeled like scabs from the walls and the heavy bags hung like corpses in the dim fluorescent light. This was where legends came to die, where champions came to remember what they used to be before the world moved on without them. The smell of old sweat, leather and broken promises hung in the air thick as fog. Rocky arrived at 4 in the morning, just like he had every day for the past 3 months. The gym was empty, silent except for the rhythmic thudding of his gloves against the heavy bag. Each punch was a conversation with his past, each combination a prayer to his future. Left hook, right cross, uppercut. The same sequences he'd thrown 10,000 times before, but somehow different now. Heavier, more desperate, like a man trying to dig his way out of his own grave with his bare hands. His reflection in the cracked mirror told the brutal truth that newspaper articles danced around. He was shot, used up, a shell of the fighter who'd gone toe-to-toe with Apollo Creed, who'd stunned Ivan Drago, who'd outlasted Clubber Lang when everyone said he was finished. That Rocky lived in highlight reels and old newspaper clippings. This Rocky, the one sweating in a Philadelphia gym at sunrise, was something else entirely. Something sadder and more desperate. But desperation, Rocky had learned, could be its own kind of strength. When you had nothing left to lose, you could afford to risk everything. When the world had already written you off, you were free to rewrite your own ending. Adrian found him there, as she always did, training like a man possessed. She brought coffee in a thermos and sat on the old wooden bench Mickey used to occupy, watching her husband attempt the impossible through sheer force of will. She'd stopped trying to talk him out of this fight weeks ago. She knew Rocky well enough to understand that some battles had to be fought, regardless of the outcome. "You're different this morning," she said quietly, pouring coffee into 2 paper cups. Rocky stopped punching and turned to face her, sweat streaming down his face like tears. "I ain't scared no more, Adrian." His voice was hoarse from exertion, but there was something else in it now, a clarity that hadn't been there before. "I was scared for a long time. Scared of getting old, scared of being forgotten, scared of failing. But last night when Tyson laughed at me, something changed." He sat down beside her, his breathing still heavy. "I remembered something Mickey told me a long time ago. He said the worst thing that could happen to a fighter ain't losing a fight. It's losing himself. It's forgetting why he started fighting in the first place." Rocky stared at his hands, wrapped in dirty tape and swollen from years of punishment. "I've been lost for a long time, Adrian, but I ain't lost no more." Across town, in a luxury suite at the Plaza Hotel, Mike Tyson was having trouble sleeping. He'd trained harder for this fight than any in his professional career, not because Rocky Balboa posed a threat, but because something about the old fighter bothered him in ways he couldn't articulate. Tyson had built his career on breaking men's spirits before he broke their faces. Fear was his greatest weapon, more devastating than his left hook or his explosive power. But Rocky hadn't shown fear, not genuine fear, and that absence of fear created a problem Tyson had never encountered. How do you intimidate a man who's already made peace with his own destruction? How do you break someone who's already been broken so many times he's learned how to put himself back together? Tyson's trainer, Kevin Rooney, found him shadowboxing in his hotel room at 3 in the morning, throwing combinations at invisible opponents with the same vicious intensity he brought to actual fights. "You can't sleep either?" Rooney asked. "I keep thinking about what he said," Tyson admitted, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. "About not being afraid of getting hurt. I've fought a lot of men, Kevin. They all talked tough at first. They all said they weren't afraid. But when I hurt them, really hurt them, they all broke. They all showed me their fear." He stopped shadowboxing and stared out the window at the lights of Manhattan. "But this one's different. He ain't talking tough. He's talking true. And I don't know what to do with that." Fight night arrived like a storm that everyone saw coming, but nobody could stop. Madison Square Garden transformed into a coliseum where modern gladiators came to spill blood for the entertainment of 20,000 bloodthirsty Romans in expensive suits. The media had dubbed it the execution, and ticket scalpers were getting 5 times face value from people who wanted to witness history, specifically the history of Rocky Balboa getting erased from existence by the most dangerous man who ever lived. The undercard fights moved with the mechanical precision of a funeral procession. Each bout was just killing time until the main event, like appetizers before a feast of violence. The crowd grew more restless with each passing minute, their anticipation building to a fever pitch that made the air itself feel electric and dangerous. In his dressing room, Rocky sat quietly on a folding chair, wrapped in the same torn bathrobe he'd worn for every significant fight of his career. It was threadbare and faded, held together by duct tape and stubbornness, much like its owner. His hands were already wrapped, his gloves laced and ready. But he wasn't shadowboxing or jumping rope or doing any of the ritualistic preparations that most fighters used to channel their nervous energy. He was writing a letter. "Dear Rocky Jr.," he wrote in his careful, childlike handwriting. "By the time you read this, you'll know how this fight ended. Win or lose, I want you to understand why I had to do this. Not for the money, not for the glory, but because sometimes a man has to remind himself who he is. Your old man ain't the smartest guy in the world, and he ain't the strongest or the fastest, but he never quit on nothing that mattered. And you matter more than anything." The letter went on for 2 pages, full of misspelled words and awkward sentences, but every word carried the weight of a father's love and the wisdom of a man who understood he was about to face something that might kill him. When he finished, he folded it carefully and placed it in his gym bag, where Adrian would find it later. Meanwhile, 3 floors below, Mike Tyson was transforming from man into monster. His dressing room pulsed with dark energy, rap music playing at bone-rattling volume, the smell of anger and adrenaline thick as smoke. His entourage moved around him like priests serving a violent god, each person knowing their role in the ritual of preparing Iron Mike for war. Tyson's shadow boxed with a ferocity that made his sparring partners step backward. Each punch he threw at the air carried enough force to cave in a human skull. His breathing was controlled but predatory, like a panther preparing to pounce. When he looked in the mirror, he saw exactly what 20,000 people expected to see: death incarnate, violence personified, the end of Rocky Balboa's story written in bone and blood. But somewhere deep in his mind, in a place he tried never to visit, a small voice whispered doubts he couldn't quite silence. What if the old man really wasn't afraid? What if fear had been Tyson's greatest weapon all along, and he was about to face his first opponent who was genuinely immune to it? The call came simultaneously to both dressing rooms. 15 minutes. Rocky stood up slowly, his knees creaking like old floorboards. He looked around the small, cramped room that smelled of liniment and desperation, trying to memorize every detail. Win or lose. This would be the last time he sat in a dressing room before a fight. This was the end of something, though he wasn't sure what. Adrian kissed him gently, her eyes dry because she'd used up all her tears weeks ago during the sleepless nights when she tried to talk him out of this suicide mission. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too," Rocky replied. "No matter what happens out there, remember that everything I ever did was for you and the boy." 3 floors below, Tyson received the same 15-minute warning. He stopped shadowboxing and stood perfectly still for a moment, centering himself in that calm, deadly place where he did his best work. His handlers bustled around him, but he tuned them out completely. In 15 minutes, he would walk to that ring and do what he'd been born to do, destroy another human being with his bare hands. The only question was why he didn't feel as excited about it as usual. The walk to the ring was a journey through the valley of the shadow of death, and Mike Tyson was both the shadow and the death. His entrance music, "Welcome to the Terror Dome" by Public Enemy, pounded through Madison Square Garden's sound system like artillery fire. The bass line alone could have stopped hearts, and when Tyson appeared in the tunnel, 20,000 people rose to their feet in a mixture of awe, fear, and bloodlust that felt almost religious in its intensity. He moved through the crowd like a shark through dark water. Black trunks, black shoes, no robe, just pure, undiluted violence walking on 2 legs toward the squared circle. His cornermen followed behind like pallbearers, their faces grim with the knowledge of what was about to happen. This wasn't going to be a fight, it was going to be a public execution, and they were the executioner's assistants. The camera caught every detail. The way Tyson's muscles rippled under the arena lights, the predatory focus in his eyes, the slight smile that played at the corners of his mouth like he was remembering a private joke. That smile was the most terrifying thing about him because it was genuine. Mike Tyson enjoyed this. He lived for these moments when he could unleash every ounce of rage and violence he'd accumulated over 21 brutal years of existence. But then Rocky's music started. "Gonna Fly Now," the same theme that had carried him up those Philadelphia museum steps a decade earlier. And something shifted in the arena's atmosphere. The crowd's bloodlust mellowed into something more complex, more human. Here came the sacrifice, walking to his own altar with his head held high and that same quiet dignity he'd shown at the weigh-in. Rocky's entrance was everything Tyson's wasn't. Where Tyson moved like a predator, Rocky walked like a man going to church. Slow, purposeful, respectful of the moment and the magnitude of what was about to happen. He wore simple red trunks and a blue robe that had seen better decades. His face was calm, almost serene, like a man who'd made peace with whatever gods controlled the fate of broken-down prize fighters. The crowd's reaction was different too. Not the primitive roar that had greeted Tyson, but something sadder and more complex. Applause mixed with scattered boos, respect mixed with pity. Everyone knew they were watching a good man walk into a nightmare, and they weren't sure how to feel about being entertained by it. When both fighters reached the ring, the contrast was almost comical. Tyson paced like a caged animal, shadow boxing, rolling his shoulders, radiating enough violent energy to power a small city. Rocky stood perfectly still in his corner, eyes closed, lips moving silently in what might have been prayer, or might have been a conversation with his deceased trainer, Mickey. The referee called them to the center of the ring for final instructions, and this was when most fighters felt the full weight of their opponent's presence. Standing 2 feet away from Mike Tyson, feeling the heat radiating from his body, seeing the focused violence in his eyes up close, this was where most men realized they'd made a terrible mistake. But Rocky just listened to the referee's instructions about protecting themselves at all times and touching gloves if they wanted to, all while maintaining that same quiet composure that had unsettled Tyson at the weigh-in. When the ref asked if they wanted to touch gloves, Tyson extended his hand with that predatory smile, expecting to feel the tremor of fear in Rocky's handshake. Instead, Rocky's grip was steady, warm, almost gentle. And when their eyes met over their clasped gloves, Tyson saw something that stopped his psychological warfare cold. Rocky wasn't looking at him like an opponent or an enemy. He was looking at him like another human being who happened to be sharing this strange, violent moment. There was no hatred in those eyes, no fear, no false bravado, just acknowledgement and, impossibly, something that might have been compassion. "Good luck, Mike," Rocky said quietly, so only Tyson could hear. No one had ever wished Mike Tyson good luck before a fight, not sincerely, not like they actually meant it. For just a moment, standing in the center of that ring with 20,000 people screaming for blood, Mike Tyson felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood. He felt seen, not as Iron Mike the Destroyer, not as the heavyweight champion, but as Michael Gerard Tyson, a damaged kid from Brooklyn who'd learned to turn pain into power and rage into money. The moment passed quickly, but it left something behind, a crack in Tyson's armor that hadn't been there before. The opening bell rang like a gunshot in a cathedral, and Mike Tyson exploded from his corner with the controlled fury of a natural disaster given human form. This was his moment, his sanctuary, the place where all the childhood trauma and adult rage transformed into something beautiful and terrible. He moved like liquid violence, cutting off the ring with the precision of a master chess player and the intent of a serial killer. Rocky, by contrast, moved like a man underwater. Not slow, exactly, but deliberate, measured, as if he were conserving every ounce of energy for something the crowd couldn't yet understand. He circled left, away from Tyson's devastating left hook, keeping his gloves high and his chin tucked behind his shoulder. Old-school defensive boxing, the kind Mickey had beaten into him during 10,000 hours in Philadelphia gyms. The crowd was on its feet before the first punch was thrown, sensing they were about to witness something historic. 20,000 voices merged into a single roar of anticipation that shook the building's foundations. This was why they came, to see two men reduced to their most primitive selves, to witness the kind of primal violence that civilization spent centuries trying to suppress. Tyson stalked Rocky like a panther, his head weaving hypnotically, making himself a difficult target while simultaneously setting up devastating counters. Every movement was calculated, every step designed to put Rocky in position for the kind of knockout that would replay on sports shows for the next 50 years. This was Tyson's ring generalship at its finest, creating chaos while maintaining perfect control, appearing wild while executing a methodical destruction plan. Then he struck. The first combination came so fast it barely registered on film. Left hook to the body, right uppercut aimed at Rocky's chin, left hook to the head, 3 punches thrown in less than a second, each one carrying enough force to drop a heavyweight. The body shot landed clean, driving the air from Rocky's lungs with an audible whoosh. The uppercut missed by millimeters as Rocky pulled his head back just enough. The left hook caught him on the shoulder, spinning him halfway around. Any other fighter would have been down. Any other fighter would have been hurt, confused, ready to be finished. But Rocky absorbed the punishment like a man who'd spent his entire career learning how to take punishment and keep moving forward. He stepped inside Tyson's next combination, clinching, holding, buying time for his head to clear and his breathing to normalize. "Is that all you got?" Rocky whispered in Tyson's ear during the clinch, his voice barely audible above the crowd noise. Tyson shoved him away with enough force to knock down most men, but Rocky just reset his stance and came forward again. There was something hypnotic about his advance, not fast, not spectacular, but absolutely relentless. Like watching a glacier move, except this glacier bled and grunted and absorbed punishment that would have hospitalized ordinary humans. The second exchange was more violent than the first. Tyson landed a right cross that snapped Rocky's head back so hard that blood sprayed from his nose in a crimson arc that caught the arena lights like scattered rubies. The crowd gasped collectively, certain they'd just witnessed the beginning of the end. Rocky staggered backward, his legs betraying him for just a moment, giving Tyson the opening he needed to land the knockout blow that would end this mismatch. But instead of falling down or covering up, Rocky did something that no one expected. He smiled, blood streaming from his broken nose, left eye already swelling from Tyson's previous punches, and he smiled like he'd just heard his favorite joke. Then he stepped forward, directly into Tyson's power, and threw a left hook that caught the champion completely by surprise. The punch wasn't particularly hard or fast. It didn't have the technical perfection of Tyson's combinations or the devastating power that had made Iron Mike famous. But it landed clean on Tyson's jaw, and for the first time in his professional career, Mike Tyson took a step backward, not because of strategy or ring positioning, but because another man had hit him hard enough to make him move. The arena fell silent for exactly 3 seconds. In the span of those 3 seconds, 20,000 people processed what they'd just witnessed. Then, the noise returned, doubled in intensity, as everyone realized they weren't watching an execution after all. They were watching a fight. What happened next defied everything the experts knew about boxing, everything the odds makers understood about mismatches, everything the 20,000 witnesses thought they knew about the nature of dominance and submission. Mike Tyson, who had never been hurt by a professional opponent, who had never stepped backward from anyone's power, found himself dealing with something completely outside his experience. He wasn't hurt, not physically. Rocky's left hook had been solid, but not devastating, more of a sharp reminder than a real threat. But psychologically, something had shifted in that ring. For 21 years, Mike Tyson had lived in a world where he was the predator and everyone else was prey, where his presence alone was enough to break men's spirits before he broke their bodies, where stepping into the ring with him was essentially stepping into a cage with a hungry tiger. But Rocky Balboa wasn't behaving like prey. Tyson responded to the indignity of being hit with a fury that bordered on insanity. He unleashed a combination that should have been illegal in most civilized countries. Left hook, right cross, left uppercut, right hook. Each punch thrown with the intent of not just winning the fight but of permanently altering Rocky's genetic structure. The sound of leather against flesh echoed through Madison Square Garden like gunshots in a tomb. Rocky absorbed every punch. Not gracefully, not easily, but completely. His head snapped back with each impact, blood spraying in artistic patterns that painted the canvas in shades of red and defeat. His legs buckled twice, his knees touching the canvas for just a moment before he forced himself upright again. By any reasonable standard, he should have been unconscious. By any medical standard, he should have been hospitalized. Instead, he kept coming forward. "Why won't you go down?" Tyson heard himself asking. Though he hadn't intended to speak, it came out as a growl, filled with frustration and something that might have been fear if Mike Tyson was capable of experiencing fear. "Why won't you stay down?" Rocky's response was to throw another left hook, this one slower than the first, but somehow more determined. Tyson slipped it easily, but the intent behind it, the absolute refusal to acknowledge that he was being systematically destroyed, was more unsettling than the punch itself. This wasn't boxing anymore. This wasn't sport. This was something primal and religious, a test of human will that had nothing to do with skill or power or even survival. The crowd had gone from bloodthirsty to confused to something approaching awe. They were witnessing something that shouldn't have been possible according to the laws of physics and human endurance. Rocky Balboa was being beaten to death in slow motion, but somehow death was losing the argument. Round 3 began with Rocky looking like he'd been hit by a truck, then backed over by the same truck for good measure. His left eye was completely closed, his nose was definitely broken, and he was breathing through his mouth in short, painful gasps. His corner worked frantically between rounds, but there was only so much that ice and adrenaline could accomplish against the kind of systematic damage Tyson had inflicted. Yet when the bell rang, Rocky came out of his corner with the same measured determination he'd shown in round 1.